Okay, and we haven't talked about government-created monopolies like drug companies, and we're going to talk about them in the next section when we talk about intellectual property. So the Clayton Act, one of the things the Clayton Act does, remember again now when we get to 1914, we're seriously into the progressive era. And almost all of the major labor laws that are in the United States, that exist in the United States now, were passed between 1900 and 1940. That's when we passed pro-labor legislation. It's the only time in the history of the United States that Congress passed laws that were good for workers, that were intended to help workers. So the Clayton Act exempts labor unions from the antitrust laws. You can't sue a union for being in violation of the antitrust laws, for being a monopoly. Okay? Labor is not a commodity, therefore it's not covered by these. Number two, Clayton Act creates what we call treble damages. So if you sue Microsoft and you can prove that Microsoft hurt you to the tune of $1,000, Microsoft doesn't owe you $1,000, they owe you $3,000. There's a very famous case. You may know that a long time ago, well, not that long ago, the 80s, there was a football league called the United States Football League, the USFL. And they operated in the spring. Donald Trump actually owned one of the franchises in the USFL. They got run out of business by the NFL. The NFL threatened the television networks and said any television network that, and they did this in writing. They didn't even pretend, right? So they sent a letter to the USFL that says sent a letter to all the television networks saying you will not be on the NFL if you show USFL games. So ABC had been showing USFL games. They had a choice between USFL or Monday Night Football. They kept Monday Night Football, wipes out the USFL. USFL sues under the Antitrust Act, under the Sherman Act, saying, hey, that is contract combination conspiracy. It's attempted monopolization, blah, 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 blah. It's illegal. The jury says, yes, the NFL has violated the antitrust laws of the United States. The problem is that the jury was afraid of hurting the NFL and therefore awarded the USFL $1. So the USFL wins in court against the NFL, gets $3 because treble damages. So the jury awarded them $1 and the NFL had to pay them $3. So lots of other things that are in Clayton Act. One is interlocking directorates. Every corporation is run by a board of directors. If General Motors and Ford, or MGM, Mirage, and Caesars were to have the same people on their boards of directors, what would that do to competition? If all the hotels in Vegas were separate companies, but they had a bunch of directors on their boards that were the same people. So the first way the companies start getting around the antitrust laws is to have these separate companies and say, hey, look, we got all these separate companies. There's 10 companies. And yeah, but there's 3 people who are on the board of directors of all 10 companies. And okay, so, right? Number 2, the Clayton Act messes with price discrimination. Again, Robinson-Patman that comes later is more about this, but price discrimination can be illegal. So we talked about what price discrimination is. Charging different prices to different customers can be illegal under the Antitrust Act. And then the Clayton Act says the government can control mergers and acquisitions. So and I put these up here, when MGM bought Mirage, Steve Wynn used to own the Mirage. When MGM bought the Mirage, the federal government had to approve the merger. So the federal government approved the merger, said it's okay for MGM to buy Mirage, and now there was a company called MGM Mirage for a while. I put over in the left-hand side AT&T, Time Warner. AT&T wanted to buy Time Warner. The media, and we'll talk about this more when we get to intellectual property, but what's happening is that the transmitters of media. AT&T is a transmitter of things. People have their phone service from AT&T, are buying content. So AT&T has control over television shows and movies and so on that they can sell to their subscribers who use their phones. It's what we call vertical integration. It's not two competitors merging, it's a supplier merging. So it would be the same as a car company buying a steel company. That would be the same thing, a horizontal merger, or a vertical merger rather. So you have these vertical mergers. The government tried to block this, and they tried to block it because Time Warner owned CNN, and this was going to possibly make some money, and the current administration, the White House, didn't like CNN, and they went to court multiple times, and multiple judges said, no, you can't block a merger because you're mad at CNN. There was no economic reason presented for blocking the merger. It was a political reason, and the courts ruled that you can't block a merger for a political reason. You can only do it for an economic reason. The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, their job is to make sure that businesses do not do unfair or deceptive practices. So Listerine mouthwash used to argue that they cured the common cold. Cured the common cold. Well, they did that for years and years and years, and then one day the government went to them and said, hey, do you have any proof that you actually cure the common cold? And they said, well, ask anybody. Everybody knows. Well, of course they don't cure the common cold, and they have no evidence that they cure the common cold. So nowadays, Listerine ads say, we kill 99% of the viruses and bacteria in your mouth, blah, blah, blah. But they no longer can advertise that they cure the common cold because they don't have any proof that they do. What's in an ad has to be true, except that when Congress did this, they exempted political ads. So politicians do not have to legally tell the truth in their ad. And it's very difficult to sue a politician, as it turns out, for lying because they're exempted from all of these laws about having to tell the truth. Other things that are included in this are things like bait and switch. That's when they advertise that they've got, carpet for $1 for your whole room, but it turns out they only had one roll, and once you get in there, they don't have it what they advertised, and they try to switch you into something else. If you ever watch television and you see a car ad, there's always little tiny text, right? It'll say, brand new Ford Mustang, $15. And then in little tiny text, it'll say that we have one at this price and it's subject to prior sale. If they don't tell you that one might be sold by the time, there's only one of them and they might sell it by the time you get there, now they're guilty of bait and switch. So they put in little tiny letters that don't stay on the screen very long, that they only have one of these or two of these or three of these, and they might be sold by the time you get there. Okay? So they have to tell the truth. They have to explain things. When you get a loan from the bank, they have to give you plain English stuff. There's all of these concerns about something that they might do which might be unfair or considered unfair or deceptive. Okay? So a whole bunch of cases in here. AT&T used to be a monopoly provider of telephone service. The government originally thought it was more efficient, and in fact the military was in favor of having one telephone system for the entire country. This is when telephones had wires, and AT&T was sued and fought and fought and fought. In this case, went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and it's really not resolved until the 70s and 80s, and it's not resolved until AT&T decides that they want to get into the computer business, and then they drop their opposition. What happened when they dropped their opposition is that telephone service immediately improved a lot. If you have a monopoly, they're not going to be very efficient, and they're not going to have low prices. The cost of telephone service went down. The quality of telephone service went up because we got rid of the monopoly and all of a sudden opened up competition. You don't have to buy your phone nowadays from one company. We used to have to pay for long distance. If you wanted to call, if you lived in northern half of San Diego, you had to pay to call the southern half of San Diego. Pay. You had to pay. I lived for a year in Solana Beach. My office was in San Marcos. It was 35 cents to call my office. Right? Now most of us never pay a dime for long distance, at least within the United States, because we got rid of the monopoly. We opened up to competition. Competition is wonderful if we have competition. The government sued IBM as being a monopoly in the computer business. It dragged on and on and on and on. IBM just snowed them with paper, and it dragged on and on and on and on. And finally, it became clear that the market was going to take a different path, and we ended up with Microsoft and all this other stuff. And the whole reason for suing IBM disappeared. The government sued Saran Wrap when it came out, a little after it came out, because they were a monopoly. They were the only company that sold clear plastic wrap. The government said, hey, that's a monopoly, and sued them. The jury said, fools, there's other stuff besides clear plastic wrap. There's aluminum foil. There's Tupperware. There's nothing that Saran Wrap does that we can't get done some other way. It's not a monopoly. And the government lost. They sued the breakfast cereal companies. It's called the Kellogg case. The breakfast cereal companies are what the government called a shared monopoly. They had a tacit agreement, according to the government, that they would run their businesses a certain way. And again, if you go to the grocery store, all of the, where Kellogg's is and where Quaker Oats is and all that is the same in every store, right? The cereal aisle is pretty identical depending on, doesn't matter what store you go to. The government lost. And the reason the government lost is they couldn't prove. It was tacit collusion. It was unofficial. There wasn't any discussion. There weren't any agreements. There weren't any phone calls. It's tacit collusion. It's secret deal that's not written down and not formally agreed to. And the government couldn't actually prove that there was a deal going on here, even though it seems pretty obvious that there was something going on. The government couldn't prove it to the satisfaction of a court.